Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you all today. This is the first session of the Book of Genesis through the lens of ancient biblical interpretation with Dr. Chanan Gafni. Always a great pleasure to have him back teaching at Parashah. This course introduces participants to the rich and diverse world of ancient Jewish biblical exegesis, traditions, and texts often overlooked in conventional study settings. We will explore a variety of lesser-known interpretive sources, including the Apocrypha, Jewish Hellenistic literature, ancient translations, early poetic transliterations, as well as the systems of biblical vowels and cantillation marks. Each session will focus on a different type of source, highlighting its unique contributions to the understanding of the weekly Parashah. As I said, Dr. Gafni, in addition to being a multiple-time teacher at Parashah, is a teacher at the Rothberg International School at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, among other places. He received his PhD from Harvard University and a postdoc at Ben Gurion. And sources will be shared on screen in a PowerPoint momentarily. And with that, I'm going to hand over the mic to Dr. Gafni.
Okay, so it's great coming back to Drisha after a while, and it's also great starting to discuss the Sefer Bereshit this week. We started reading it in shul, and now it's great to also have a session and a study group that we can also discuss it and talk about it at greater length. And what I chose to discuss today is, or the theme of this course is the Book of Genesis in ancient biblical interpretation. So today we'll start with some introduction, and then we'll get into the material itself. Often, when people discuss or think about Jewish interpretations to the Bible, more specifically to the Torah, people think immediately about all those commentators that accompany Mikraot Gdolot, or Mikraot Gdolot. Commentators like Rashi, Ibn Ezra, Rashbam, Ramban. Those names are the names that come to mind at first when we just start thinking about Jewish interpretations. However, all these known interpreters were only active in the second millennium, meaning probably from the 11th through the 15th, 16th century. And sometimes we forget, or we don't take into account the rich and diverse world of interpretation that existed before that time, essentially in the first millennium. Now, needless to say, people do take into account rabbinic literature, meaning Midrash, the Talmud. Obviously, those texts we're more familiar with, and also the medievalists were influenced by those texts. However, there are many, many other sources and traditions that sometimes we don't really include in our discussion. Some of them are even not known to many of the Jewish scholars. And our goal in this class is to learn about those texts and also to demonstrate some of their ideas, focusing on Sefer Bereshit, on the Book of Genesis. And I want to start by asking, maybe you remember from the introduction, but I'll still repeat that again. I want to ask you, what are the most ancient Jewish interpretations of the Bible? And again, I'm not speaking about Rashi, Ramban, and Ibn Ezra from the second millennium. I'm trying to address earlier sources. What earlier sources do we have? What other ancient Jewish interpretations exist? And I'm limiting myself to Jewish interpretations, not any interpretations that have to do with the Tanakh, Jewish interpretations, and focus mainly on the Torah. So what type of interpretations do we have other than rabbinic literature? Yes, if you want
to... Sherry?
Yeah. Yes, Josephus, pseudepigrapha.
Okay, so you're mentioning two different important, you mentioned Josephus, one author that belongs to a whole corpus of what we refer to as Jewish Hellenistic literature, meaning literature that was composed by Jews, but written in Greek and also influenced by the Hellenistic culture. Okay, so that's one type of text. You also mentioned, what else did you mention?
Pseudepigrapha.
Pseudepigrapha. So we usually speak about the pseudepigrapha along with the Apocrypha in general, what people in Hebrew would call Sfarim Chitzonim, external books. Very good. It's a good start, but we need more ideas. Yes.
Targum Onkelos.
Okay, so you're referring to Targum Onkelos. Targum Onkelos is one of many translations. In the first millennium, and even before that, in the first millennium BCE, there were already all sorts of translations of the Bible. And as we will learn later in the course, translations are also a form of interpretation. So since we have many translations, we basically have a whole world of further or more types of interpretations presented in the form of translation. So far we included 3 items. We spoke about Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha. We spoke about Jewish Hellenistic literature, and we also mentioned the translations. What else do we have? What is the most ancient interpretation that exists? It's a tricky question. What's the most ancient form of interpretation that we can speak about when we deal with the Bible, with the Torah? Yes.
In
Helen,
the Tanakh
unmute yourself.
itself,
Yeah, Ellen, yeah.
within the Tanakh itself, there are references.
Excellent, excellent. People refer to it, sometimes people refer to it as inner biblical interpretation or intertextual interpretation, all sorts of titles, but the Bible is its own commentator or its own interpreter, and that's probably the most ancient form of interpretation. What else? So far we have 4 items. We spoke about the Bible itself as its own interpreter. We spoke about Jewish Hellenistic literature. We spoke about Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha. What else?
I mean, I suppose the Mishnah also a little bit.
Okay, so the Mishnah is one of many texts that are part of the large corpus of rabbinic literature, and that's more known. We will designate one class for rabbinic literature, but we're more familiar with those texts. Also, the medievalists were more influenced by those compositions, but obviously you're right. The Mishnah is one of many rabbinic texts, along with the Midrash or the Talmud. But all those are included in one group, in one category, rabbinic literature. What else do we have? I'm trying to write a paper today, and I want to include all the sources that existed in antiquity that have to do with Jewish interpretations of the Torah, of the Bible.
I mean, the Septuagint.
So the Septuagint is another translation. It's not in Aramaic, it's in Greek, but it's another form of translation. Okay, so I'll give you the list. And it's probably not the entire list, but at least we'll include a few more items here. So what are the most ancient, what texts are included, what sources are included among ancient Jewish biblical interpretations? So as we just mentioned before, the most ancient type of interpretation is the Bible itself, what people sometimes refer to as intertextual interpretation or inner biblical interpretation. All those are accepted terms. So the Bible is its own commentator or its own interpreter, and we will soon see that this is we'll address all sorts of examples of this later on. The next one, books that didn't make it into the Bible, but were probably considered related to the canon, are the Apocrypha books. Here we can distinguish between Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha. We'll have a whole class designated to those compositions. So there are certainly a whole nother group of texts that could be used as a form of interpretation, because they're not just additional books, they're books that also shed light or reflect or present their commentaries on or explanations of the Tanakh itself. We mentioned Jewish Hellenistic literature. We mentioned Josephus, who's just one of many Jewish writers influenced by the Hellenistic culture. The Dead Sea Scrolls, you should have mentioned that one. In terms of its form, it's related perhaps to the Apocryphal books, but nevertheless, they're usually considered as a separate category, and we should also address those group of texts as a form of ancient Jewish interpretation. All of this, needless to say, is way before the second millennium. We're talking about texts that were composed during Second Temple period. Next, translations of the Bible. It could be both Aramaic or Greek or other languages as well. Since we're limited to Jewish interpretations, so we're mainly dealing with Aramaic and Greek. In other languages and in other cultures, there are probably many, many more translations that could be taken into account. what else can we do? We're still, we still have a long way to go in terms of our list. We mentioned rabbinic literature, Mishnah, Talmud, Palestinian Talmud, Babylonian Talmud, Midrash. They're all included in rabbinic literature, and I'm not going to get into the details right now. Vocalization and cantillation system.
Oh.
The nikud and the ta'amim could also be, or should also be, viewed as a form of interpretation. And I hope to designate a class for that as well. The tradition itself includes the letters, the consonants. However, at some point in Jewish history, people added the nikud and the ta'amim, the vowels and accents. And vowels and accents are also a form of interpretation. They also have a say in terms of how we understand the words of the Torah and how we understand what they mean. We'll have to designate a whole class for that and try to elaborate and demonstrate why they're such an important source of interpretation. I did not include them at the very beginning of the list because they're actually a later addition to the text, but this again deserves a whole class. Piyut, liturgical poetry. In ancient times, people wrote piyutim, poetic texts that were supposed to be recited as part of tefillah, as part of davening. And in those texts, very often, they also interpret biblical texts. The Parashat Shavua was interpreted through or in the course of all those piyutim. So that's another source of interpretation, ancient Jewish interpretation. Mystical compositions. There are all sorts of mystical compositions for the first millennium, what we refer to as Safrut HaHeichalot, for example. All these books, mystical compositions from ancient times, also include interpretive elements, parts or elements that involve interpreting biblical texts. And finally, archaeological findings. Very often through archaeology, we also learn about how certain passages, how certain verses in the Torah were interpreted in antiquity. So what I'm trying to demonstrate now is that there's a whole world of text that one can consult when you deal with ancient Jewish interpretation. And very often we're familiar, or we tend to focus on the ones that we're more comfortable with. Rashi, Ramban, Ibn Ezra, they're much later. And even if we dare move earlier, we will usually focus on Chazal, and we don't usually take into account this rich world of texts. Before we start discussing each one of them more in greater length, I want to ask you a question. All these texts they come from different worlds or different types of compositions, and they present very, very different types of interpretations. And I don't mean in terms of details, that one mefaresh, one text will read a particular story in this manner and the other one will read it in a different manner. There's substantial, dramatic types of differences between these forms of interpretations. It's not just, more detailed or specifics. They have different features, and they read the text in very, very different manners. And what I wanted to ask you is, why do you suppose these different texts have different ways of reading the Bible? What will be the factors that determine the way that a text tends to read the Bible? What are the fundamental differences that create differences or distinguish between different types of interpretations? And again, if I was just talking about details, so you can say, look, he read this verse like that, and he was reading it slightly different. But I'm trying to think, what would be the crucial factors that make different scholars read the Bible differently? What are the elements? What are the I would say the factors that make sources read the Bible differently?
Dr. Gafni,
I'll show it in the form of in my slide.
Dr. Gafni, just a question from the audience.
Yeah.
From Ellen, how ancient are vocalization and cantillation?
So we'll have a whole class for that.
Okay.
You'll have to wait, okay? I'm waiting also, but we have to do one thing at a time. It really deserves a whole class, and it's an amazing story, but we can't do everything at once. We'll just do it slowly, and eventually we'll address that also. I'll tell you a little bit about the my plan for this semester, for this series, and then you'll know when we might address that. Okay, so I'm asking you again. This is my question. I say here different Jewish interpretations or different ancient Jewish interpretations have different features or read the text differently. And my question is, what do you suppose are the causes or factors that explain different approaches to the text? What will be the factors that make different people read the text differently? Sherry, yeah.
Where they were at that, what their lives were like, what was going on, because I can see that today. Why, what I look for in interpretation, I have questions because of what's happening in my life, in my world, in my
Excellent.
worldview today. So that's
Excellent.
what that forms the questions that I'm going to ask.
Right. So this is probably the most important element that we will see, and soon I'll show you my screen. And I also listed that as the first element. The origin of the interpretation, both time-wise and geographically, historically and geographically, certainly have a lot of impact on the way that a person would read the text. Right? One is very often influenced by the historical or geographical context in which he's operating, and that certainly would be visible through his interpretation. It's not the same thing if you're writing the Perush, your commentary in Eretz Israel or in Chutz La'aretz. It's not the same if you're reading it before the destruction of the temple or after the destruction of the temple. And these are just two important distinctions, and we can probably think of many more issues or historical or geographical facts that might influence the way people read the text. What else? So we said the origin of the text. Yes.
Okay, so also having an agenda.
Okay, so the ideological agenda of the author. So I want to even generalize it even more. Obviously, the identity of the author plays an important role in his interpretation, his own biography, his own psychological world and ideas, his ideology. That is certainly something that needs to be taken into account when we try to characterize a form or a type of interpretation. And that could be a reason for crucial and not just local differences between different interpretations. What else? Yes.
Well, I'm going to say slightly different from Sherry. I think similar, but not the same. It's like acculturation, or however you want to put that.
Okay, Mitsuyan. You mean the cultural context?
Well, some people are Hellenized and some people aren't, and I assume
Excellent, excellent. It could both be cultural or religious. When you're operating in a Christian context, you might be reading the text differently than when you're in Islamic lands.
Right.
Or if you're reading it in a Persian context, it might be the same as reading it in a Roman or Greek or Byzantine rule. So that could be certainly could influence the way people read the text. What else? Yes.
If they have a particular other commentator or other interpretation in mind, they might be reading the text in dialogue or in conversation.
Okay,
or
so this also has to do with the cultural context. You're saying a bit more specifically, they're also consulting or influenced by other interpreters that are out there. What else? I think there are many more factors that you need to take into account.
Rabbi Gafni, maybe the gender, going very specific, the gender of the interpreter.
Okay, so this again, it's true, but it has to do with the biography, or I would relate that to the realm of issues that involve the identity of the author. You're absolutely right. What else? I need more. Okay, so I'll give you some answers because we don't have unlimited amount of time and I want to cover so much more. So I wrote this list, the following list. The first thing, origin, as Sherry was mentioning, right? The location, historically, when and where the text was composed, crucial for understanding or for appreciating or for evaluating the interpretation. Cultural environment. Ellen, that's what you were saying in a sense, right? Where was it written, but not necessarily geographically, but also from a cultural perspective, whether religious culture or not just the religious aspects. So that's another factor. The identity of the author plays a crucial role, but when you talk about the author, it's not just about the author, it's also about his audience. Who is he writing it for? When you write text to different type of people, you read them differently. You write differently. If you're writing your interpretation for Jewish people, it's not the same as if you might be reading it for non-Jewish readers as well. If you're reading it for popular, for a more popular crowd, it's different than if you're reading it for learned scholars. So the audience that one has in mind has certainly influenced the way you reinterpret a text. Your aim, aspiration, ambition. Why are you writing your interpretation? Are you concerned with legal issues? You want to tell people how to live the Bible on a practical level? Are you a philosopher? You're mainly invested in this, dealing with philosophical questions or theological questions? Are you trying to please your audience and make it more aesthetic and more appealing and more amusing? That might influence the way you read the text or what you focus on. If you're writing your text for the purpose of using it as part of tefillah for liturgical purposes, it will influence the way you interpret the text. So the idea, the setting that you're planning for your interpretation influence very much what you will say. Just like today, when you have a full hour shiur, it's not the same as if you're giving a 5-minute talk. And if you're giving it in front of a large crowd, you speak different than if you're learning it one by one. The audience that one has in mind influences greatly the way you read the text. The genre, it's a little bit connected. What type of literature are you writing? Are you writing it in a form of poetry, or are you writing it as prose? What type of writing are you presenting here? Is this a technical legal composition, or is it something that is being more artistic? The nature, the genre of your text has a lot of influence on the way you would interpret the text. It's not just a technical difference. It influences the content of what you will say. You will be focusing, you will be tuned to different elements in the text, and you might also read them in a different manner. The language plays a role. Are you writing your text in the original language of the Bible or in a form of translation? The shift from one language to another might also influence the way you read a text. Finally, the relationship to the biblical text. When you write a translation, for example, you need to provide a substitute for each word in the original. But when you're writing a text such as a midrash, or if you're trying to pick specific verses for very technical reasons, and you might not address every part in the text. If you're writing it for legal purposes, you might skip the narrative. And if you're writing it in order to amuse people, you might skip the legal elements. So different people have different commentators will address the text differently. They have different relationship to the biblical text, or for what they feel they need to address in the course of their interpretation. So despite the fact that we're dealing with a lot of scholars that read the same Bible and seem to want to understand it, it doesn't mean that they're going to read it in a similar manner. And as I'm emphasizing, not just on a technical or local or specifics, they have very, very different agendas, or they're writing their text in in various forms and shapes and for different purposes, and it greatly influenced the way that they read the text. One of the goals of this course is not just to become familiar with the different types of interpretation, but try to see how the form or the context or the nature of each type of interpretation might influence the way that they read the text, not just to talk about, quote texts or, paragraphs from this type of text or that type of text, and understand that this is a rich world of interpretations. Also try to understand the nature and the way that different genres might affect the way that scholars in antiquity approach the text. It might influence what they want to tell us about the text, or how they evaluate it, what they want us to learn about that text when they read when they read it and when they interpret it. Before we start getting into the details, I have one more thing I wanted to ask you. What did all these interpretations have in common? I just elaborated for 10 minutes addressing the big differences between all those ancient Jewish interpretations, but I think we do need to emphasize one thing that they shared in common, something that was true for ancient Jewish interpretations. Obviously, I'm talking about Jews who are reading the Bible or the Torah. They did have something in common, some idea that they all share. I'll try to help you. Yes.
Well, I think they all felt themselves to be part of one common tradition.
Right. So I think it has to do with their feeling part of a tradition, and also what did they think about the text? I think that is a very important element that influenced the way that all those scholars read the text. They all viewed the text when they talk about the Torah. They all felt what?
Was
Ellen?
it divine? Was it
That it's
divine?
divine, right? They all had, despite those differences in antiquity, in contrast to what we might find today or in other periods in history, in ancient Jewish times, all those interpreters did have something in common. All ancient Jewish interpretations reveal a traditional approach to the Bible. And what does that mean? Traditional approach to the Bible. I would emphasize, as you said, they treat the text as divine. And what is that? How does that influence the way we read the text if we think it's divine? How does that? What impact does it have on the way we read a text? Yes.
Well, so it's inerrant. It's perfect in many ways, among which nothing is extra, nothing is left out that needed to be there.
Okay. So first, in terms of the formulation, you're saying it's precise, but I think it goes beyond the formulation. It's not just that the text is presenting itself in the most clear and concise way. It's beyond that. What else? If it's divine, therefore what?
It's
How does
more.
that affect the way we treat the meaning of the text or how we address it?
It's
If it's
more.
divine,
There's a huge
yes,
level of respect that's
you
going
have
to go
respect
into
for
the
it,
interpretation.
right?
It
You have
almost
respect,
eliminates things. Well, it might eliminate things like sarcasm or humor about the text. It might really shade the entire formulation.
right? So the humor, or I don't know, maybe our God does have
Maybe
some
not
sense
even
of
so much
humor.
humor, but I mean
I don't know about God's
sarcasm.
sense of humor, but at least I would
Sarcasm.
say if we view the text as divine, we always assume that if it comes from God, it has to be the first thing we need to say, it's true, it's accurate. But it's not just accurate. The laws are supposed to be something that we can follow. It's ethical, it's precise. The historical facts must be true. The scientific information must be accurate because it comes from God. God doesn't make mistakes. In contrast to what modern scholars might think when they read the text and they would say, oh, this is just a reflection of some ancient human ideas from generations back. When we view this text as divine, we also have this need to defend the text, to assume that everything about this text must be true and accurate. I always like to bring this, and I chose this example because it has to do with the Parashat Shavua, but this is just one example of many. And when the Torah talks in the story of Adam v'Chava, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, so we hear God commands Adam. I'm reading it in English. One of you can read it I'm sorry, I'm going to read it in Hebrew. One of you can read it in English. ויצב השם אלוהים על האדם לאמור, מכל עץ הגן אכול תאכל, ומעץ הדעת טוב ורע לא תאכל ממנו, כי ביום אכולך ממנו מות תמות. Who wants to do the English? Just for making sure that we're on the same page. And the Lord God commanded. Who's reading?
It's okay,
Wants to read?
Sandra, I can read. And the
Okay.
Lord God commanded the man, you are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. For when you eat from it, you will surely die.
So God is telling Adam, if you eat from the tree, in Hebrew it even says more specifically, Beyom acholcha mimenu mot tamut, the day you eat from the tree, you shall die. At least that's one way of reading it. Then comes the serpent, and the serpent says, no. ויאמר הנחש אל האישה, לא מות תמותון, you will not die. כי יודע אלוהים כי ביום אכולכם ממנו ונפקחו עיניכם והייתם כאלוהים יודעי טוב ורע. Ellen, you want to read?
Yours, you will not certainly die, the serpent said to the woman. For God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil, or everything, as the case may be.
Okay, so my question is, who's telling Adam and Eve the truth? God or the serpent or the snake?
Well, the snake is technically correct, but depends on
Whoa. So let's see what the text says itself. What does the Bible say? Just a few verses later, we just read this a few days ago. The text says, "ותרא האישה כי טוב העץ למאכל, וכי תאווה הוא לעיניים, ונחמד העץ להשכיל, ותיקח מפריו ותאכל, ותיתן גם לאישה עמה ויאכל. ויאמר השם אלוהים, הן האדם היה כאחד, I skipped a little bit, הן האדם היה כאחד ממנו לדעת טוב ורע. ועתה פן ישלח ידו ולקח גם עץ החיים ואכל וחי לעולם. Or in English, briefly, we don't have so much time, briefly, yes. When the woman saw,
when the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. And she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and the Lord God said, the man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever. So the snake is at least.
so when you read it at first glance, it seems that the snake was actually right. They didn't die on the one hand, and their eyes were open, as the snake predicted, and they became knowing good and evil, just like God. And God even is saying later on, man has now become like one of us. This is what the text seems to be saying. But if you will consult ancient Jewish interpreters, nobody would say such a thing. Nobody would dare to say that God misled Adam and Eve, that God was not honest, that God was not giving them all the information for whatever reason. They all assume that this text is accurate. So how do they defend? How would they defend? Just I didn't include sources here. So how would they defend what the text is saying? Did God lie by telling them the day they eat from the tree they die? What did God mean?
Mm-hmm. Well, he meant that it would happen eventually. He didn't mean that it would happen that moment, but that moment that they did that would change the future course of what would happen to them.
So when God says, Ki biyom acholcha mimeno mot tamut, the day you eat from the tree you will die, it just means you will become mortal, not that you will die that day. Well, usually we don't read the words mot tamut in such a manner. If one violates the laws of Shabbat and the Torah says mot tamut, we don't say eventually you will die. He's being stoned that day.
Right.
We don't read it that way. There are other types of interpretations that people suggested or offered for this verse. Some people said that perhaps, yes.
Well, so like there's this fuzzy thing about how long is a day, like
right. Ki elef shanim be'enecha ki yom etmol. 1,000 years could be equivalent to God. So when God says a day, it means a day in God's terminology. Well, usually when the Torah speaks about a day, it means 24 hours. When we observe the Shabbat, we observe 24 hours, not 1,000 years. So all these are, and what does this mean? What does that show? That when scholars approached the text, they were very apologetic. They had all sorts of assumptions. If you consult modern interpretations, they read the text very differently. They don't feel obligation to defend the text or to read it in a way that makes God look good, because they don't view the text divine and holy the way that traditional people read the text, and also the way that ancient Jewish interpreters read the text. So I think that's a very basic distinction between critical scholars and traditional scholars. And I think it's probably mostly true, or almost entirely true, that in ancient times you will rarely encounter observations that in any way deny the holiness or the divine value of this text, and therefore they feel they need, in general, to defend the text and to make it say accurate things, ethical things, and nothing that would make the text sound wrong or not ethical or not precise. Okay, so this is a little bit about the introduction, and now I'm going to talk to you about the goals of this series. This series really needs many lectures. It's not enough to designate 5 sessions for this, but we're limited in time. And so what I'll tell you what I wanted to do. We can't discuss all those ancient texts. What I was planning is to designate each week, each session, for one type of interpretation, or one of those texts or sources, type of sources that we included at the beginning of the class. And what we will try to do is as follows. First, we'll try to become familiar with that type of interpretations, describe it, speak a little bit more into details about the nature of this type of interpretation. We will also try to understand, to examine the impact of the form on the content, meaning in what way this type of interpretation will tend to read the text in specific ways. What can we say? And if it's one author, so we can talk about a particular author, but if we're speaking about a genre, how does this genre read the text? And what can we say more general than just specifics it happens to read the text here in this manner or not in that manner. But if can we say something more general about the nature of different types of interpretations and how they tend to read the Bible, the Torah. So that's the second thing. Learn about each one of those types of texts, groups of texts, and also try to come up with some idea of the impact or the connections between the form, the nature of this type of interpretation, and its content, the way it tends to read the Bible. The discussion will be accompanied with examples. We're not going to speak in a theoretical manner. We'll each time address some examples. All of our examples are within Sefer Bereshit. As I promised in the course, in the title of this series, it's Sefer Bereshit in the lens of ancient Jewish interpreters. I tried to do beyond that and focus at least on one example from the Parashah that we read or that we're about to read. So this way you have something to think about over the weekend. So it's not just about Sefer Bereshit in general, but also something more particular that we're dealing with in that week before, in the previous Shabbat or the coming Shabbat. And but I also will allow myself to expand to other texts in the Torah. What are we going to open up with today? So today we're going to deal, the first session will be designated to intertextual interpretation, or in Hebrew, people refer to it as Parshanut Pnim Mikra'it. Parshanut that is found within the Bible. That's the official term. In English, people use different, people address this type of interpretation in different forms. Some people refer to it as intertextual interpretation or as inner biblical interpretation. In Hebrew, the term is usually Parshanut Pnim Mikra'it. We'll first describe this type of interpretation, and then we'll talk about a few examples. And the theme I wanted to focus on today is the story of the flood, what we're about to read on Shabbat. But first, a few words of introduction. So I'll tell you the list of stuff we need to address, and then we'll do it one by one. These are the issues I want to address when defining this type of interpretation, intertextual interpretation. Definition, words and ideas, explicit and implicit, shared language or setting, wordplay or meaning, local or canonical, interpretation or reflection, and the historical dilemma. Now we'll do it one by one, and we get to the end of the list, you know we're done. So definition, what is interbiblical or interbiblical or intertextual interpretation? What does that mean? Somebody wants to offer us a definition. What does that mean? When people refer to the Bible as its own interpreter, what do we mean?
Oh, like this past Shabbos when Chava was named, it said Chava, which means she was the mother of all.
Okay, so you're talking about a place where the Bible, within the verse, the Bible explains itself. But
Right.
I'm talking about even something more general. Very often, one text in one place in the Bible is addressing or is helping us decipher or understand another text in a whole different location, in a whole different context. And this is what usually scholars refer to when they talk about intertextual interpretation, not within the same chapter or the same verse, but even two distinct passages or chapters, or even different books in the Bible might have some dialogue going between these two compositions, in that one text is indirectly referring, addressing, and also interpreting the other texts. So this is what scholars refer to when they talk about intertextual interpretation. I'm continuing.
Wait a second, Dr. Gafni, would this be an example of that for example, in Esther, when Boaz is described as the Ish Gibor? Gibor is used in a different sense than it had been in other texts.
Okay, so you're leading to the next item that I wanted to address.
Okay.
Everybody will agree that different parts of the Bible help us understand difficult words. Meaning, sometimes you have a word that is unclear that appears in one place in the Tanakh. We don't know what that means, but its appearance in a different place or in another book where it's more clear helps us understand the meaning of the word. So from a linguistic perspective, it's obvious that we need the Bible to help us understand. We need to consult the entire Bible to understand its words because it's a whole language. I'm not addressing such local needs that occupy people who write dictionaries. I'm more interested in larger ideas. How does one text not just help us understand particular words, but also to understand much more broad and general ideas? And we'll soon see examples and you will understand what I mean even better. Explicit and implicit. Very often, one story that appears in the Bible will be referred explicitly in another text. When we read the Hallel on Rosh Chodesh, we say, Betzet Yisrael mimitzrayim, Bet Yaakov me'am lo'ez, and it goes on and it talks about the story of Betzet Yisrael, the story of Exodus, right? Yetziat Mitzrayim. That's explicit type of interpretation. The chapter in Sefer Tehillim, in Psalms, is elaborating, is describing what he thinks was what was going on during the time of Exodus. That's explicit. It's found, this is also very common, that one text will explicitly refer or address another scene from earlier books in the Bible. That's true, but that's not as amusing, as not as interesting. What's more fascinating to find those places where it's not explicit. But if you use very careful, your instincts very careful, you see that what at first appears as separate text actually is taking into account or having in mind another story in the Bible. It's creating a dialogue with another text, even if it's not stated explicitly, but rather implicitly. When we talk about stories that create a dialogue, they could be, the dialogue or the connections could be noticeable either through words that they choose. They will use concentrated number of words that connect those two texts. We'll see that many terms or words, or even more broader terms or sentences that sound alike. That could be one way that these two texts could be connected. Or sometimes they tell a story that resembles the other story, even if not employing the same precise words. But the setting, the nature of the story sometimes leads us to think that there's some communication going on, some dialogue between those two stories. All of this we'll try to demonstrate in a minute. Scholars often argue, this is a big argument. Sometimes I even argue with my wife when we read these texts. You often find two texts that use similar language, and it's clear that one text is thinking about the other text. But the question is, how far do you go with that? It could just be a technical device that you tell a story and you employ similar words because they kind of, the association is created because you're talking about a similar scenario. So why not use or employ similar words? That's on a very low level of connection, if it's just a stylistic issue. But scholars often assume that when two chapters use the same words, they're not just trying to tie between these two texts on a very superficial or stylistic level, but they're trying to say something beyond, and it's not just a stylistic question that the Torah is trying to create. It's something that is supposed to influence how we understand the text. So some scholars are more minimal about their observations about these stories that connect. Others would come up with more dramatic ideas about the nature of this connection, of the meaning that the text is trying to add. But in many cases, it will always remain something very speculative because the Bible will not tell us what it's trying to do. And again, I'll try to demonstrate that in the next few minutes. Local or canonical. Sometimes the connections are created within the same book, and sometimes we're talking about two distinct books in the Bible. It is very different when the author himself is creating connections between different parts of his own book, or if one book of the Bible is reflecting or thinking about another text. And it obviously influences the way we appreciate it. If the same author is creating links between different texts, it's one thing. We try to read and try to attribute that to the author himself. But if it's a different book, it might be ideas that somebody else wants to convey, or his understanding, his observations of another text, and it's a whole different ball game. So that's another factor that one needs to take into account. when we talk about intertextual interpretation, it's not always interpretation. It could also be reflections or ideas, what the other text triggers or what thoughts it brings. And in a second, I'll also demonstrate that. And last thing, and then we move and try to explore some example, the historical dilemma. We're not always sure when we deal with two texts that are communicating which text came first. It's not always so obvious. And sometimes it's unclear what was the original and what's the response, which text came first and which text is only alluding to the earlier composition. And it even touches on very, I would say, sensitive issues such as the Torah in contrast to other Nevi'im. In some cases, it seems to scholars that the Torah is actually alluding to later texts in the Bible, which seems to be more puzzling. I'm not going to demonstrate that today, but you should know that this is another question that one needs to take into account when you talk about intertextual interpretations. All of this is abstract ideas. Now you need to have some examples to know what I'm talking about. So I promised you we'll do something from the Parsha. And the story I wanted to start with today is the story of the flood. The story of the flood appears in Parashat Noach in the beginning of Sefer Bereshit, but also is alluded to in many other places in the Torah or in the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim. I told you before that sometimes we have explicit and sometimes we have implicit. Noah appears elsewhere in the Bible. The story of the flood appears explicitly in later texts of the Tanakh. For instance, in the book of Isaiah, we hear about Noah. What does the text say? I'm reading it. Ki mei Noach zot li, asher nishbati me'avor mei Noach od al haaretz, ken nishbati mikzof alaich umigor bach. English. Who wants to do the English?
Okay.
When I swore that the waters of Noah would never again cover the earth, so now I have sworn not to be angry with you.
Or in Ezekiel, והיו שלושת האנשים האלה בתוכה, נוח, דניאל ואיוב, המה בצדקתם ינצלו נפשם.
Somebody else wants to read. I'm happy to.
Yeah, sure. Even if
Yeah.
these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job were in it, they could save only themselves by their righteousness.
Okay, so this is an example of an explicit reference to the story of Noah in the Bible. We have other examples. You know, we say on Kabbalat Shabbat, Hashem lamabul yashav. Vayeshev Hashem. So sometimes the stories of the Bible appear explicitly, and we can discuss these verses and try to speculate what they're trying to teach us about the story of Noah. That's an explicit example where the Bible explicitly refers to another event or another story. That's interesting, but less fascinating. What's more fascinating is to find those implicit examples where one text reflects on the other. The first example I'm giving you is a reflection on the story of Noah and the flood within Sefer Bereshit, within the book of Genesis. First, I'll try to demonstrate or try to convince you that we're talking about two texts that are in dialogue. And once we establish that, I'll ask you, what do you suppose the Bible is trying to tell us by creating this link between these two stories? The first example is very famous, very known, but I'll still try to discuss it with you. And that's the connection between, I wrote, from the waters of the flood to the fire of Sodom. So I'll present a chart. I selected verses from both of these stories, the story of the flood and the story of the destruction of the city of Lot, the city of Sodom. And you'll see that the text or the Torah is clearly trying to connect between these two stories on a linguistic level. There are many, many words that connect these two stories, but also the setting is very similar. We're talking about a great destruction, right? Here it's the whole world, and over there it's just a city. Here you see you have on the right-hand side, you have verses that are taken from Parashat Noach, from the story of the flood. And on the left-hand side, you have verses that are taken from the story of Sodom. So which keywords? And I also included here the English translation in the following slide, but you miss a lot of that when you read it through an English translations, because the translators are not necessarily tuned to what we're looking for, and they might not be concerned in maintaining the same precise word in all those places. In Hebrew, when you read it in the original, it's much more visible.
Oh, yeah.
So, for example, the word that is being used for destroying, what's the root? We have in the story of the flood here, "Vatishachet haaretz." The land is becoming corrupt. Hishchit kol basar et darko al haaretz. People have corrupted their ways, and therefore God is mashchit otam. God will destroy them. The same root appears in the story of Sodom. Mashchitim anachnu et hamakom hazeh. Lashchit is to destroy, or yeah. Vayishalchenu Hashem leshachata. The angels are saying, "We're here to destroy the city." Mashchit Hashem et ha'ir. So you see the root lehashchit appears in both stories. In both stories, the hero is saved in a closed space, and God closes after, or shuts the door after him. By the story of Noah, it's the flood. He's in the ark. Vayisgor Hashem ba'ado. God shuts the door of the ark after he's in. And also with the story of Lot, he's brought into his home, and the angels close the door before the drama will start. The hero is being remembered by God who saves him. We also have the root lehamtir, to rain. It's true both when it comes to the water in the story of the flood, but also in the story of the Sodom. God is being mamtir, rain. I don't know what word I would use, going down from the heaven, but the same root, lehamtir. So these two stories are clearly connected through the Bible's language. It's not just the setting, destruction of two cities, but they're also linked through words, very specific words, and sometimes rare words that don't appear that frequently in the Tanakh or in the Torah, that tie these stories together. What's also interesting is the appearance of wine at the end of both of these stories. In the story of Noah, after the flood, he gets drunk. In the story of Lot, after the destruction of the city of Sodom, he also his daughters bring him wine, and he also falls asleep. He's also drunk, essentially. And the kids are also involved in both of those stories. Both in the story of Noah, there's some involvement of the kids, and also in the story of Lot. The Bible is clearly connecting between these two stories. If we were minimalists, we'll say, okay, it's just a stylistic connection. But scholars often say, no, the Bible is trying to tell us something. What is this parallel supposed to convey? What is it supposed to make us think about? I'm giving you half a minute to come up with one idea because we need one more example. What is the Bible trying to make us think about when it connects the two stories? Are they similar, or maybe it's actually trying to emphasize an important difference?
Well, moral behavior is what induces the consequences.
Okay, so that's a very clear connection, but that's too obvious. You're right,
Okay.
absolutely right.
Okay.
But I want us to think beyond that, because that could just be we're talking about similar stories, we employ the same type of language. But I think maybe the Bible is also trying to teach us something beyond that. Maybe it's teaching us about different ways of reacting to the destruction. In the story of Noah, what's the end of the story? Noah is so depressed after what he's seen. What does he do? Or what's the role of the wine in his story? Why is he drinking wine?
As a comfort?
As comfort. He's trying to forget about everything. The wine is basically an expression of Noah's depression. His attempt just to escape everything, escape the experience he's gone through. In the story of Lot, we see a very different reaction. The wine is actually being used for a new creation, for trying to establish a new world. His daughters don't even know that anybody existed, and they have very positive energies, unlike in the story of Noah. So maybe this is a way of expressing different reactions of different people to destruction. Maybe Noah indirectly is criticized for deciding to escape reality and hide in his own world, whereas the story of Lot is bringing another opportunity or another way that people are able to deal or react to such traumas that they went through. This is just a similar reading. I'm influenced by some article I wrote by Shmuel Klitzner, if you know who he is. You might have taught Adrisha in past sessions, I don't know. And but this is already saying something beyond the linguistic or stylistic connections between the story. We're trying to compare them and try to learn some idea that maybe the combination of these stories being read together is leading us to think about. This story of the flood also appear elsewhere, but this time it's not within Sefer Bereshit, but also in one of the books of the prophets, a book that you all know. And I'm referring to the story of here. I wrote here Noah in the ark and Jonah in the fish, in the belly of the fish. Before I show you the chart, what links between these two stories, which words might link these two stories together? So I'll show you. We have 3 more minutes, so we need to rush. So I'll show you some examples, and then I'll try to ask you, what do you think? What do you make of that? The corruption of both places, both of the world or of Nineveh, is described with the word Hamas. I don't know what associations you have in mind. So the Hamas appears in both stories. The period of 40 days, both in the story of Noah, the flood took place, or God warns the world that within 40 days, after 7 days, the flood will start for the course of 40 days. In the story of Jonah, we also hear about 40 days before the destruction of the city. It's not just about man, also about animals that are involved in the destruction. Adam and Habema both appear in Jonah and in the story of Noah. Hayonah, think about the word Yonah. Yonah appears both in the story of Noah. He sends away the Yonah, the pigeon, or I don't know how you translate Yonah in English, from the ark, and you have Yonah, the name of the prophet. These are, and I just included here very few of many, many linguistic or terms that connect the two stories. What is the Bible trying to teach us? Assuming, again, we have to establish and accept the fact that this is not a matter of coincidence, that these two stories, even if not explicitly, but implicitly, are trying, one story is reminding us of the other story. It's using so many words that are similar. And again, I didn't read with you all the words. I could have included many, many more. I just brought you some more obvious ones. What is the text saying here? And here, scholars suggested something even more dramatic. Perhaps the story of Jonah here is not talking about a different way that people can react to destruction, but maybe it's also describing God in a different manner. In the story of Jonah, God gave up immediately. God is not trying to change this reality, and he's not even expecting Noah to make any change. He just assumes this world is corrupt, we have to start all over again. The story of Jonah, the story of Jonah, is giving us a whole different possibility from God's perspective. You don't have to destroy the world immediately. God is trying to teach Noah, don't give up. Before I destroy something, before I do haficha, before I destroy the city or the world, I want to make sure that there's no way for redemption, for tshuva. And Yonah here is the one who needs to understand that. So God has a very different role in that story. This is a very subtle, but perhaps opposition to the story, or it's a very strong reaction to the story that Noah in Sefer Bereshit, the author of Sefer Yonah, in a sense, is criticizing, or he's a little bit upset with the way that God is operating in the story of Noah. And he might be telling us there's other ways that God could have reacted. Maybe God should have given them another chance. He's not saying it explicitly, but implicitly, you read that. God's call for people to repent is missing in Sefer Bereshit and very visible in Sefer Yonah. These are just two examples of reflections on the story of the flood in different books in the Bible. And I think one of the most, and with that sentence, I'll be done for today. One of the more interesting and unique things about reading the Bible as its own interpreter is that you're not reading it from a perspective of a later commentator. In a sense, it's the divine text itself that allows itself to comment and to bring different perspectives on stories.
Hmm.
Just think, even in the story of Sodom, it's the same book. And indirectly, we hear different voices, different expectations. What are people supposed to do when they face such a crazy trauma? And the author of Yonah, again, presenting it as words of prophecy, attributing his words to God himself, allows or opens up the possibility of God treating humanity in a very different manner. So these are fascinating examples. It gives a lot of room for thinking. In the presentation, I included 20 more examples. There are like 30 more slides later on, because I always prepare a lot more. But I think it's a nice, what we did today is a nice, interesting demonstration of how rich and how interesting is this tool or this method of looking and comparing these verses. And every parasha in Sefer Bereshit is in dialogue with another story. I collected a lot of them. You have to trust me. In every parasha, you will find, you can detect those intertextual words. And I don't mean cases that are considered, very speculative, even things that are almost are clear cut. What meaning you attribute to those connections is a separate question. But the fact that there are all these dialogues between different texts is very, very clear. And you can really write a whole book on later books interpreting Sefer Bereshit, or the book of Genesis interpreting itself, explicitly and implicitly. Next week, we'll do another type of text. I think we're going to do it. We'll see. Maybe Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha will be the topic for next session. And each session will do something different. We only have 5 sessions at this point, so we'll have to choose of the list that I presented before, our top 5.
Yeah.
But this one had to be the first one. It's the most ancient one. We couldn't skip the first one.
Dr. Gafni, I just want to make one question to leave you with. You don't have to answer. I mean, couldn't you just then go through a concordance and find where you see that word and then connect it with just almost
It's a great
arbitrarily?
idea. So that's a very good point you're saying. People, the problem is that very often we're not talking about the precise word. It could be the same root, or it could be, it's not necessarily going to be so visible. However, what you're suggesting is actually being done today. Scholars do try, but it's not just finding one word. You want to find a concentration of many terms or similar words,
Yeah.
a concentration of like Lihinachem, Yonah, 40 days, all of them together, and that creates a stronger link. If you just find one word, it's not going to be enough. But people use the computer today to doing that stuff.
Yeah.
And this is really endless what you can do with that. But it also is something that always will remain speculative. When do you decide that 2 texts are actually thinking about each other? And if they do, what are they trying to do what are they trying to teach us by that comparison? And that will always remain open. That's part of the beauty of this type of interpretation, that it leaves room for so much thought, for so much ideas that we can come up with.
Yeah.
So it's not really sealed. It leaves a lot of room for more further thinking.
Yeah.
I wish we can talk about a whole series about interbiblical stuff. It's a very, very rich and amazing world, but we only have one session for that, unfortunately.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Great. Thank you very much. Terrific. See
Okay.
you next
Bye-bye.
week.
Thank you, everyone. Hope to see you all
Thank
next
you.
week.
Thank you.
And I
Wonderful.
just want to highlight one upcoming class also starting this week as part of Fall Zman, the book with Dr. Rachel First at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. I hope to see you at her class or at any of our other offerings over the fall. Take care and thank you.